The storm came without warning, a cold rain sweeping across the sleepy town of Maple Ridge just as the evening lights flickered on in the distance. The small diner on the corner of Main Street glowed dimly through the downpour, and inside, sitting in a cracked red booth, was Ethan Cole, a single father who'd spent most of his 36 years working too hard and hoping too little. Across from him sat his 7-year-old son, Noah, his skin pale, his tiny fingers trembling as he tried to lift a spoonful of soup that had long gone cold. "Daddy," Noah whispered, his voice thin as paper, "my chest hurts again." Ethan's heart clenched. He reached across the table and brushed back the boy's damp hair, feeling the heat radiating from his forehead. "We're going, buddy," he said quietly, dropping a few crumpled bills onto the table. The waitress called after them, concern on her face, but Ethan was already scooping Noah into his arms and running through the rain toward his beat-up pickup truck. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital was a blur of headlights and fear. The wipers screeched against the windshield, fighting a losing battle against the storm. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other gently pressed against Noah's small body, feeling the rise and fall of his uneven breaths. He whispered prayers he hadn't said in years, desperate, stumbling pleas to a God he'd stopped believing in when Noah's mother died giving birth. By the time they reached the emergency room, Noah's breathing had turned shallow, his lips tinged with blue. Ethan threw open the truck door and yelled for help, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. Nurses rushed forward, their faces blurring as they lifted Noah onto a stretcher. Ethan followed, soaked to the bone, his boots leaving puddles on the white-tiled floor. "Please," he begged, his voice trembling, "someone help my boy." Moments later, a doctor appeared, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "What's his name?" she asked, glancing at the monitors as Noah was wheeled into an examination room. "Noah," Ethan replied, barely holding himself together. "He's had this cough for weeks, but tonight it got worse, he couldn't breathe." The doctor nodded, her expression tightening. "We'll take care of him," she said. As she turned to give orders to the nurses, Ethan caught sight of her face, and his heart stopped. He knew that face. The years had changed her, softened the edges, but those eyes, steady, focused, filled with warmth, were unmistakable. Dr. Grace Turner. The name echoed in his chest like a bell from another lifetime. 15 years ago, Grace had been the girl next door, the one who used to laugh with him under the stars, the one he thought he'd spend forever with. They had dreamed of escaping their small town, building a life together, but fate had been cruel. Her scholarship took her across the country, and his father's death forced him to stay behind, running the family garage to survive. They'd lost touch after that, though Ethan had never forgotten the way she used to write, "Someday," at the end of every letter. But someday never came. Until now. Grace didn't recognize him at first. Years of hospital nights and exhaustion had a way of dulling the past. But when she looked up again, really looked, her eyes widened. "Ethan," she breathed. The world seemed to freeze around them. He nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, it's me." For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other, two ghosts from different lives reunited in the most unthinkable circumstances. But the beeping of the monitor snapped Grace back into motion. "We'll talk later," she said softly. "Right now, we need to save your son." Ethan stood helplessly at the corner of the room as Grace worked with a quiet intensity that left no room for emotion. Her voice was calm but commanding as she instructed the team. Oxygen mask, IV line, blood tests, chest X-ray. Ethan's mind spun with fear, guilt, and disbelief. How could this be happening? Noah, his only reason for breathing, lying so still on that sterile bed. Every second felt like a lifetime. When the nurses wheeled Noah out for tests, Ethan slumped into a chair, his hands trembling. Grace approached him then, her eyes tired but kind. "He's stable for now," she said softly. "It looks like pneumonia, possibly severe. We'll know more soon." Ethan exhaled shakily. "Thank you," he whispered. Then, after a pause, "I can't believe it's you." Grace smiled faintly, a trace of the girl he once knew flickering across her face. "Life's full of surprises," she said, sitting beside him. "How have you been, Ethan?" He let out a hollow laugh. "Been better. Lost the garage last year. Been picking up odd jobs. Noah, he's all I've got." Her eyes softened. "He's lucky to have you." Ethan shook his head, guilt clouding his eyes. "I should have brought him in sooner. I thought it was just a cold, but," he couldn't finish. Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're doing your best," she said. "And that's what matters." Hours passed. The storm outside eased, but inside, the air was heavy with waiting. Ethan dozed off in the chair beside Noah's bed, his rough hand resting over his son's small one. When he woke, dawn was creeping through the blinds. Grace was still there, sitting quietly with a clipboard in her lap. She looked exhausted but didn't complain. "His fever's coming down," she said when she noticed he was awake. "He's responding to the antibiotics." Relief washed over Ethan like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank God," he murmured, his voice cracking. As the morning wore on, they talked, cautiously at first, then with growing ease, like two old friends rediscovering a forgotten language. Grace told him about her years in Boston, her return to Maple Ridge to care for her aging mother, her decision to work at the small-town hospital despite offers from prestigious clinics. Ethan told her about losing his wife, about the nights he'd spent fixing engines under a single light bulb, just to keep the bills paid. There was pain in both their stories, but also resilience, the quiet kind that grows in people who've learned to keep going no matter what. Days turned into weeks. Noah's recovery was slow but steady. Grace checked on him every morning, even when she wasn't on duty. She brought him comic books and told him stories about brave little boys who fought off dragons disguised as fevers. Noah adored her. Ethan noticed how her eyes lit up whenever she made him smile, and something deep in his chest began to stir, something he thought he'd buried long ago. One evening, after Noah had fallen asleep, Grace and Ethan stepped outside the hospital for coffee. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. "You've done a good job with him," Grace said quietly. "He's strong." Ethan smiled faintly. "He gets that from his mom." There was a silence between them, tender but heavy. Then Grace said, "I never stopped wondering about you, you know. About us." Ethan looked down, his voice low. "I thought you forgot." She shook her head. "I tried to. But some people stay with you, no matter how far you go." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the years fell away. The ache, the distance, the what-ifs, all of it dissolved, leaving only the truth they'd both carried in their hearts. But before either could say another word, an alarm blared from inside. Grace's face changed instantly. "Noah," she gasped, sprinting back inside. Ethan's heart stopped. He followed, his legs barely working. When they reached the room, Noah was seizing, his tiny body shaking violently as nurses rushed to stabilize him. "He's not breathing," someone shouted. Ethan was pulled back as Grace took charge. "Epinephrine, now. Start compressions." Her voice was steady, but her hands moved with fierce desperation. Minutes dragged into eternity as Ethan watched helplessly from the hallway, every instinct in him screaming to trade places with his son. Then, suddenly, a sound. A gasp. Noah's chest rose. The monitor beeped steadily again. Grace exhaled, tears glistening in her eyes. "He's back," she whispered. Ethan collapsed against the wall, overcome with gratitude and disbelief. When she stepped out moments later, he pulled her into his arms. "Thank you," he sobbed. "You saved him. You saved my boy." She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "No, Ethan," she said softly. "He saved me. That night changed everything." Grace began visiting them at home after Noah was discharged, first as his doctor, then as something more. She helped Noah with his schoolwork, laughed at his jokes, and stayed late to share dinner with Ethan. Slowly, warmth returned to the little house that had long felt empty. And as months passed, love, quiet, steady, and unspoken, grew between them once again. One spring morning, Ethan stood on his porch watching Noah chase butterflies in the yard. Grace stepped beside him, her hand finding his. "You ever think about fate?" she asked, smiling. "Every day," he said. "If that storm hadn't hit, if you hadn't been on call," she squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe some things are meant to find their way back." Years later, when Noah stood on that same porch in his graduation gown, Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Grace was beside him, now his wife, her arm linked with his. Life hadn't been easy, it never was, but it had come full circle in a way that neither could have imagined. The storm that once brought fear had, in the end, brought them home. And in that moment, watching his son laugh beneath a sky clear and bright with promise, Ethan realized something profound. Sometimes life takes everything from you, only to return it in a form more beautiful than you ever dreamed. Because love, Real love doesn't vanish with time or distance. It waits, quietly, until the right moment to return. And when it does, it heals everything.